Abigail, one time I think I'm gonna learn how to get in as the
I don't know what we do. It would be like, I appreciate
I
that.
don't know. I just it's saved to my phone that way, so I think I just click into it. Oh, I swear, it's been a long day. I guess.
You're all good. I always know.
Thank you. When I saw you click it over, I said, "Praise the Lord for Abigail." I tell you, I'm gonna get this phone. I'm truly gonna get this phone thing down. I tell you.
No worries. All right, I'm going to drop the link to tonight's deck again in the chat. Oh wait, hold on. I want to do that for everybody. I'm gonna do that one more time. So our attendees can also see that. Okay. So people can feel free to follow along. This deck is very long, but a lot of it is an appendix with just a whole bunch of information. So don't panic. We're not gonna go through all of these slides. All right. I know that this evening Christina is on a plane, I believe, as we speak. Kathy had a conflict; she could not. She couldn't move. Oh, hello, Walrick. Sorry, that little person is just. I'm so glad that he's joining us. Hi. And Kelly is still working, is going to sign on at least to listen for the latter part of our meeting, but will probably not be able to join us, but she weighed in. And that said, because all of you are total rock stars, all of those folks still managed to provide their input through the survey. So we'll have their perspectives in the room, even though they aren't able to be here. And a huge thank you to all of you for turning that around in less than 48 hours. It really, I think, will help us focus our conversation. And I appreciated all of the very thoughtful comments people made, which everyone can see. They're not attributed to individuals, but you can see them in tonight's deck, so you can hear directly from your colleagues. So with that, let me share my screen. All right. Myself all organized so I can see your beautiful faces at the same time. Okay. So we are going to be looking at a bunch of the same topics, but hopefully landing the plane on a few of these. I'm feeling very optimistic about where we are, because there was a lot of kind of confluence in what people shared in the survey. I wanted to start just by circling back on one of the things that came up at the beginning of last week's meeting, which is about as people have been hearing about the supplemental payments and our first report, there have been questions people have been raising around how this is going to work and what more information there is, et cetera. And we talked a little bit about what made sense in terms of getting some information out, recognizing that ECE is already underway in beginning to figure out a lot of the details that are going to start to that are going to need to be figured out in order to move forward. But that's going to be a little bit of an ongoing process. And so ECE is gathering questions from folks because it's really helpful for them to know what are some of the things that people are asking about, because that will help sort of drive some of the planning work. At the same time, some folks from the Under 3DC Coalition have put together some FAQs as well, based on what we've been hearing from various stakeholders. to really just break down what is in the report. So obviously anybody can read the full report, but it's a lot in there. And so it helps to just break down a little bit what some of the key things are that that are going to be of particular interest to folks. So we'll figure out in the coming days what makes sense in terms of how that information gets out, and sort of, you know, who it's coming from, and how we get it out to folks. But just wanted to circle back with everyone with that update. So it'll be an ongoing process in terms of communication, obviously, but wanted to just respond to that particular question that folks had raised last time. Anyone have anything on that they want to chime in about or clarify? And again, as I said last time, I think it is reassuring that people are starting to ask questions and respond to what's initially been put out there, because it means that the word is getting out, and that's obviously going to be a really important part of this in order to make it work well, to have all of the folks who this will affect beginning to engage and get the information around how this is going to go. So we are going to return to our conversations around salary scale and long-term funding mechanism. As all of the task force members know, you all weighed in on these questions in this survey. So I'm going to be sharing sort of where that kind of fell out. And I am hopeful that we're at a place where we're pretty close to being able to translate where the task force has landed into written recommendations in a report, which obviously everyone, as with last report, will have a chance to look at before we finalize anything. But so my goal for the first portion of this meeting is to really just see if there's anything in here that folks who are sort of have the minority opinions among the group feel really strongly about and want to make their case about, because we obviously want to give people a chance to hear that. But that just to give you a little bit of a sense of how I'm thinking about this. So with that, what I'm going to do is share the two pieces that we have been talking about kind of in tandem, because they're so connected to each other. So one is around conceptually how we build in experience into a salary scale, you know, what the approach is to that, and then similarly how what the sort of management of that process is. So we talked about this last time. These slides will look familiar to people who've been following along, but they keep evolving. So the details are a little bit different. But this is what you all saw task force members in doing the survey. Essentially, we noted a values tension between, and this is obviously simplistic, but on the one hand, placing a high value on consistency across child development facilities in terms of incorporating experience, and on the other sort of side of the scale, a high value on autonomy at the CDF level. So that was sort of the balance we were thinking about. So in thinking in response to where task force felt like they landed on that, overall task force members lean towards that autonomy at the CDF level, with the caveat that you know, there are a lot of folks at that sort of leaning towards that, but with particular caveats they wanted to note. So wanting to, you know, make sure that there's some elements that people think about. In particular, there were a couple of caveats that got named a number of times from different task force members. So one is around a strong feeling that as part of this, while there should be that autonomy at the CDF level, that there should also be a sample pay scale that is offered to CDFs to use or adapt, and along with some TA for technical assistance for child development facilities to develop their own policies. So this is all in line with some of what we've talked about in the past about wanting to support facilities in building systems to the extent that they want and need that additional support. So that's one. And then secondly, that people noted that there should be some expectation that child development facilities be prepared to share information on how they factored experience into that scale, not necessarily as a required data submission, but in order to sort of ongoing support program planning and implementation. That is information that will be really, really helpful for ECE to continue to refine whatever funding formulas are down the line. I'm going to go through this next piece as well before opening it up because they're so connected. So, and again, in here, if you all click on the links, you can see the comments the task force members made on all of this. So in line with that, in line with this question of where you would put that balance, overall task force members supported this band approach that was our kind of revision that we looked at last time. Again, there was, people reiterated this point around the value of a sample salary scale that really provides specific guidance. So there could be those bands, but really helping people to see how they might translate that into a sort of operational salary scale. And that includes both how you would look at numbers over time, but also questions around for example, how you think about experience coming into a new role versus someone who's been in your facility, that sort of thing. So the basic idea, again, this is all stuff you've seen, but the basic idea is that the band approach sets the bottom and top of the scale by role and degree, as we've been talking about. It tracks parity with DCPS at the BA level, so that is a sort of one-to-one, which we know is a minority of our teachers, but that's something we want to be really clear about. And it's structured to support annual increases at a standardized % increase level, if that's where people want to go. So you could just break it down that way, but it also allows for flexibility at the CDF level. And so here's, and again, with the idea that ECE would work with stakeholders to develop guidance for facilities in terms of how they translate this to their specific context. So here's, again, what that basically would look like. These bands track the sort of essentially five steps per band that are in the DCPS salary scale. And if you start with that minimum number and you do a 2.86% increase 15 times, you get to that ceiling number. So that's the sort of very basic, simple way. But again, child development facilities wouldn't have to keep lockstep to that. And then let me just show what that looks like hold on. Okay. So again, if you wanted to translate that into a blown out step scale, that again, at the BA level, this is exactly what the starting and ending point for the DCPS scale is. It smooths out those increases, as we've talked about. And then these other levels, the AA and CDA level, mimic that. So, within this, you could cut this any number of ways. You could tie this to evaluation in various ways. You could have certain expectations around, where you start new staff members based on, particular criteria, et cetera. But this would be sort of what this looks like. So let me.
Abby, can we pause for a second? I think there are some folks who are participating in the meeting who were expecting to hear information about how, as teachers, they can access the supplemental payments. Can we take a second for the translators to state in Spanish that that is not a topic we're going to cover in this meeting? ECE will host other meetings in the spring when we're able to share more details about specifically how people can access those funds. That will not start happening until later in the spring and summer, but we will share information as it is available.
Thank you, Sarah, and I appreciate you following in the chat. I was not. Okay, great. I'm going to go back to this, and then I'm going to open the. Why can't I find? Sorry, folks. Give me one sec. Going back and forth between screens is always very exciting. Okay. So where I'm going to sort of put this out in a, like sort of a proposal form. So what I am taking from this is that overall, where the task force is landing is supporting that basic band approach. And again, there are some details that people wanted to emphasize that are noted in folks' comments and that we can work into how we describe this. And that the idea of having clear guidance and a publicly available sample salary scale, while also having that flexibility at the CDF level to apply the scale based on its context, including going beyond the numbers, and always assuming that there is that at the baseline everyone is getting the no less than the minimum salary for their role and degree. So I know that not 100% of people are on board with that, but I want to put that out as where I think we are overall and open it up for any, pushback that people want to be, to be out there with the rest of the task force, or questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other, but I'm happy to reshare it if people want to see. Sally.
Okay, so I have a few questions. So first, I guess my biggest question, because again, I'll need to explain it to like people in my group and other people who have questions. How is this any different than what we're doing right now as an industry, other than we'll have money? Because you talk about doing first a market analysis, and that's how people set their salaries now. If they can, they try to get published information, but not many folks publish what they pay. So if now we're talking about doing these bands, but within those bands we can have flexibility. So let's just say my program, for instance, if got a number of resources and I say I have an applicant or I have somebody who works for me, and I say, okay, they've got 15 years of experience. But you know what? I want to pay them more because I don't want them to go to the program across the street. So I'm going to put them into the system as having 15 years, but I'm going to pay them more so that I don't lose them, which to me then makes it just the same inequitable system that we have now, that programs that can pay more and have more resources will be able to be more attractive in terms of attracting educators. In terms of giving flexibility, well, and then also in terms of the experience and leaving it to programs to do that. One, how do we really effectively plan for the cost of this program, right? I mean, I know, yes, there's guidance, But if I interpret experience differently than the program across the street, how is a program with potentially limited funding plan to make this a long-lasting system, which we hope and want it to be? And then finally, I see that as being more burdensome. You know, if experience and credentials can be evaluated, put into one centralized system, I'm not going to have to prove every year that the person has this experience, you know, because again, you're saying that we're going to have to prove how we came up with this, you know, experience level. So again, it just brings me back to what we do now of every 6 months, I have to prove that I'm a qualified director. My teachers are qualified teachers, even though they've worked for me for 15 to 20 years. And I see this being the same thing. So I guess maybe break it down for me, because maybe I'm being a little dense. I guess I don't see how it's that much different other than the funding.
Want to open that up to folks. I certainly have some thoughts and can pull out some of what I think I've heard from other task force members, but want to just open that up to the group. Those are all reasonable questions, Sally.
Abigail, may I say something?
Yes, Marla and then Cynthia.
So I totally understand what Sally is getting at. And in some of my comments to the survey, I tried to offer some way of addressing what she was, what Sally is saying. And how do you make it equal for better funded programs, for not as well funded programs to compete with the more, the better funded programs. And so I kind of gave you a sample rough formula to try and mitigate for some of that, because that was a concern of mine. And I don't want to get hung up on the formula that I proposed, because it was truly like a back of an envelope thinking of a formula, but it was to prompt the idea of how do we balance that? Because I do see that as an issue. I also put in my survey results something like, if you are paying significantly above the scale, that there should be some process of justification some kind of way, because again, I'm trying to equalize those very tensions that Sally was talking about. And I don't know that what I offered does that well, but it was an attempt to prompt some of those issues so that we can make sure that we actually do have equity and parity.
Cynthia.
Oh, hello. I do agree with Marla, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to reply because I do still work in my facility during the day. I do agree with Sally and Marla with that, but my concern is that one piece that Sally brought up is that I don't want to continue to do paperwork that just goes nowhere. If we're going to provide this information, we want it in a central location where that we can track. If the person goes another place, we can look into the database and say, oh, this is this person experience. It's already been validated by Sally D'Italia at her company. Then I know that it's already been there. I can do a little bit of validation on my own, but I don't want to continue to build paperwork on us. That's the burdensome part. If we get the database up and running where we put the information in, and all we have to do is look in a database to verify. I don't want to just provide current information just to have information. Same information every year is going nowhere, and we need to most definitely get that system up and running. I don't think it should be burdensome on us. It should be burdensome on the government to be able to create that system.
Thanks, Cynthia. Want to open to other folks in terms of responding. Again, people who were supportive of the autonomy at the CDF level, which again was most folks. So I do want to note one thing, that that I think has come up a bunch, and I just want to clarify from what you're saying, Sally, is my sense is that anytime we've talked about whether programs should have the flexibility to pay more than whatever the salary scale calls for, my sense is that everyone has consistently said yes, that you want that flexibility. So, you know, I just want to note that if what you're talking about, Sally, is that there would be you could not do that. I mean, that's definitely autonomy.
I guess for me, I mean, this is, you know, and I'm thinking back to where this whole compensation scale started from, right? It's the Birth to 3 Act. And one of the pieces in there is access to high quality programs for all children in the district, regardless of their parents' income. And one piece in that is high quality educators, highly compensated, high quality, highly credentialed educators. If we start putting in, again, this ability for better resourced programs to pay staff more, we're going to continue the inequities of programs that cannot afford it. And I just, that is very bothersome to me. And again, I don't see how we can avoid it if we're giving so much flexibility. And I know people, and Sarah, no offense, but I know people are concerned about, you know, being ruled by ECE. You know, that's the thing. It's like, I don't want ECE telling me what to do. Well, again, it's not ECE's program. It's ECE is going to be managing whatever system, but it's not ECE, you know, going, you must do this, you know, in a compliance type of way. There's going to be accountability on both sides. And I guess I don't see how we're going to move away from the inequities that already exist dramatically in our city by doing this, other than people will be paid what they should be paid, but then others will be getting paid even more. And again, it's just, I guess, like I said, maybe I'm just being super dense and I'm not seeing it.
Taryn, Walrick, and then, yeah, Taryn and then Walrick.
I see those points and the concerns about equity. Certainly, I guess what I'm not sure I'm understanding. So I had thought of the autonomy for providers as still within those bands, or I guess within those bands. But I thought we had always, even if we used this very specific yearly experience ladder, that programs could always pay more. I thought the ladder was more of a floor and not a ceiling. So even if it's within those bands or a scale, it wasn't a ceiling, but I could be misunderstanding our previous conversations. I mean, I think the point about equity is important, and you know, obviously we should talk about it. I'm just trying to think of it. I had thought there might be that problem with both systems, and that programs could always pay more.
My comment was along the same lines. Like I was trying to figure, I had thought about it as a floor, and then also just, you know, if not this option, then how does the other option, it's dinner time. How does the other option achieve or prevent what Sally's describing from happening, unless you specify that you couldn't pay more, which I don't think is what the group wants to do.
I just want to be clear. I think that is what Sally is saying, and unless I'm misunderstanding you, Sally. So I just want to be clear on what we're.
No, but I mean, if it's a consistent salary scale that again is in parity to DCPS, I mean, those are really good salaries, right? And then we don't have to get into this competition. You know, yes, I understand we're individual businesses, but I think we also have to be in this for the business of children, which I think 99.9% of folks who are in this industry, that's what they're in it for, is because they want to work with children. They want to do what's best for children and families, and they're educators. So I guess I guess my vision was seeing it more consistent of just, this is the salary scale, and it's very black and white, because then again, what if like I've got my program and I've decided I'm not, going to go up or down. I'm going to follow it. And then somebody comes from another program because, salary doesn't always keep somebody at a place, right? You've got a program, culture of where you work and everything like that. So somebody comes and interviews with me and I say, well, what's your, experience, your credentials? This is where you fall on the scale. They will go, well, place across the street is going to give me $10,000 more. That's what I was hoping this compensation scale would avoid, because it's just going to be, it's very clear cut. There will be increases. And, I don't know, I guess that, this kind of bands and this ability, again, I think to me, it gets back to better resourced programs are always going to, I guess, win, so to speak, in terms of being able to attract, and I don't, I guess I just don't find, I find that creating an equitable system again. And in my soul, that just bothers me.
Marla.
So this is the discussion of like big states versus small states and how you have the Senate, and is that an equitable system based on population? And what I am trying to say is, I believe the various business owners have the right to pay what they want to pay. I don't think that as tax payers, we have to fund that. And I think there are ways to de-incentivize it. And that's what I'm talking about. And trying to find that balance, because we don't want what Sally's talking about. And yet, these are independent businesses. So how do you de-incentivize the fact that if you do decide to pay over, then you're going to have to do all these other things in the case of. So I think there's a way to de-incentivize this kind of going off the scale. And also this fund does not pay for salaries above a certain rate. So I think that's what I'm trying to strike the balance of, because on the one hand, as an independent business, people have their rights as business owners. In many cases, on the other hand, we are trying to find equity. We're trying to make sure that every child has opportunity to a strong, healthy start with, and so those are the balances. And I'm just trying to figure out how we can honor the principle of being a business owner, yet de-incentivize when people go off the scale.
Warwick.
So what I'm thinking about, and Sally, with your last comment, it seems like there is a separation of, it's sort of as Abigail, I think it's structured, but there's a separation of do we want the banded model versus the individual step? But in either of those cases, unless we set some sort of a ceiling, right, we won't be able to prevent what you're describing from happening. And I don't know if there's anything that we can do to prevent it from happening, but I do think, to Marla's point, that if the objective is to make sure that we're increasing the wages to the appropriate level across the industry, then what I do believe that as taxpayers, we should not subsidize that delta. So for example, if someone actually falls within band 2 at this level based on their experience, and the number is, this is going to be way off because I don't have the thing in front of me, but the number is $62,000 a year. If somebody wants to pay an additional $8,000 above that, I think that this then goes into the funding formula conversation. How do we actually calculate the purse that is available for that school? We should not fund that $8,000 delta. In fact, we should make it so that you're not funding that $8,000 delta, and we're checking to make sure that the funding allows you to bring everybody else up in line with like whatever scale we set. So I think, Sally, it seems to me like it's separating those two things, and to try to solve for what you're talking about. I do think that that's something that we should absolutely contemplate as a part of the funding mechanism, because that's our best shot at at doing it, or at least making sure that this does not fund that very type of activity that's going to drive you to the inequity that you're describing.
Marla, was that a new hand or an old hand? Old hand. Other thoughts. So I appreciate, Sally, like putting out your strong perspective here. And I'm looking at and I think you're raising important points. I mean, I'll share some of my perspective on this, but I'm also looking at the comments that people made on the survey, and I just want to make sure that people are sort of sharing their perspectives, so that we can try and come to an agreement. I mean, I think that, one, I do feel like everything that I've heard in all these conversations, whenever we talked about a salary scale, whether it was the sort of lockstep or not, I've consistently heard that people thought facilities should have the ability to pay more than what was expected. Again, I could be wrong, but I think that's what I pretty consistently heard, and so I just want to be clear that that would then be on the table. Like if there, and I'm not exactly sure even. Well, I guess we could just make that it's just part of the requirement, but so that's one thing I just wanted to just be clear about. I do think that Walrick's point around how the funding formula works to address the equity issue is a really important one, and you noted this in the chat as well, Rakaya. So to my mind, the idea of this kind of a system where there'd be a sample version of a scale that everybody would have the same access to, so that everybody knew, like, this is what this would be mapped out, this is the guidance that you would have, and that the funding for individual facilities would be pegged to what over time, and hopefully before the first round of the long-term mechanism, we'd have more information, but it would be pegged to what that average salary would be, given what we know about the workforce, degree, roles, and experience, so that within your program you have the funding to be able to deliver on the salaries that are in that scale. And if you want to make certain different decisions, you can do that, including paying more, but you're not going to get more money just because you want to do that, right? So there may be ways that people think about their budgets that allow them to go beyond that in some ways. So, but I think that the equity piece, having the equity adjustment that's really targeted towards programs that, to your point, Sally, don't have the same access to just outside resources that other programs have, so that you're able to recognize that certain programs are in you're able to sort of adjust for equity that way. Any of these is not going to be perfect on that, but I think that's conceptually where I think this comes from. The thing that I read in the comments the most was people noting that these are independent businesses and that they know their context and their needs better than the government does, and that their specific situations are different and they should have that flexibility. So I'm just playing back, and you all can see it in the deck. You can see the verbatim comments from folks. But that's what I heard from the comments that people were making. So if there are people who feel strongly about in this group, would love to hear those voices as well. Or if you feel like Sally is convincing you, that too. But I want to try and come to some agreement as a group, if we can. Walrick and then Sarah. No, just Sarah.
The thing I want to note, and I don't know that it's necessarily an argument one way or another, but I think it's something that may be helpful for people to think about, is that if you move towards a system where pay is more prescriptively tied to years experience, and there is less discretion for employers to adjust pay relative to that system. What that then will do is place very high stakes for individuals on determinations of the amount of experience they have, whether that is determined by the employer or by a central entity. And I think it is important to be aware that, determinations of experience are always going to have some amount of discretion in them. It is already quite challenging just with credentials, which are much more clear cut than experience. There are lots of cases where it, takes, a fairly complicated exploration to verify exactly what credentials people have, given that experience can be much more varied. In some ways, that is actually even harder to set really clear parameters around what it is, and sort of different employers might judge it in different ways. People might disagree with how their employer or a centralized entity judged it. And so I think just being aware of that potential trade-off, I think it can be tempting to believe there's like a specific accuracy we can get to around some of these things that may not be practical in any case, no matter sort of how you chunk it exactly.
Thanks, Sarah. Other thoughts? So I think I'm hearing from Sally and Cynthia, and tell me if I'm mishearing, that you both feel like having a more set salary scale that's very specific to that without discretion for the child development facilities is the way we should move, which is different than what's laid out in here. So are there other folks who are there? Are people like, where are folks? I want to make sure I get the sense of the group. And we may, again, ideally we get to consensus. We may not get 100%, and that's okay. But I want to know where we're leaning, so that we can draft something that people can then react to. Cynthia.
Hello. What I'm saying, I do like Sally's piece, but Warwick brought up a wonderful piece to that if you decide that you want to pay above that pay scale, you can, but it does not affect the pay equity fund. I think the flexibility is, I love businesses having the flexibility of doing what they think is best for their business, because we all are organized in a different way a little bit. But I do want to make sure that we address the equity piece that Sally is talking about. But I think the way Warwick put it a little bit, it addresses it. So I may be on the fence with that.
Well, I guess just to be clear, when I talk about people paying above, I'm not talking about the fund paying above it. So let's just, again, use an example. Someone's got 10 years of experience. And again, like Warwick, can't remember what band it is, but let's just say $75,000 for BA lead teacher role, 10 years experience, $75,000. A program that has additional resources can say, I'm going to pay $85,000 because I want what I consider the best of the best. And yeah, as an individual business, that's great. But again, for what this program should be doing, it's not going to be fair to programs that can't pay $10,000 extra from their own budgets, because perhaps they're using any additional funds they have now to increase their director's salary, to pay for instructional coaches, to change some of their operations. And so they can't, so they're going to go with what they can get from this funding, but they're not going to go above it, because the way they're working their budgets is to use other money to other parts of their program. But again, this is going to allow programs that have even more resources to pay above and do all these other things to improve quality in their program. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the fund being used to pay above it. I'm talking about programs' own budgets. And so that, I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah. Marla and then Warwick.
The reason why I'm trying to figure out how you de-incentivize what Sally's talking about, but yet not lockstep in that, is because when I was a turnaround principal, And because of the perception of the community in which the school was located, in order to potentially get quality staff and teachers, they paid a differential for equity. So equity can run that way also, right? Like some facilities are going to have a more difficult time recruiting because people perceive it to be in a certain neighborhood, or it specialized with a certain population. And so then you have to, in some ways, address that. So the harder populations to support. So that's why I'm trying to find this balance that I admit is very difficult, because we do not want people just paying, just because and running up that kind of cost. But on the other hand, recognizing if I can make, 50,000 here and 50,000 there, I might say I'm going to go there because it doesn't seem as challenging to go there over here. And so so that piece runs both ways. And that's why I want the individual businesses to be able to have some discretion, yet us to have some way of de-incentivizing, basically people doing this for no real equitable reason.
Thanks. Warwick.
I've got a song in the background. Cynthia, do you want to go until the song goes away?
Cynthia.
Is it me? Oh, I got a hand. Maybe it's an old hand.
Okay.
But no, I guess basically my question was, I don't want to say the word prohibit because it looks like it's just a set in stone, because I love the flexibility of programs. But are we saying that we want to do something or some type of recommendation that we can see if programs, because if this is in a central location, we can see, I know RC will be able to look at the data, and we can see the data will reflect if a business per se is salary gouging and trying to attract, giving 15,000 extra to the 65 that's already due for that position when it's not even warranted for that. So are we saying that this model would be, if it's $60,000 and we're saying this is what the maximum you can pay in this position, and somebody decides they want to pay another 15, the data will show that somebody is actually doing that if we have it in a central location and we can get the data on that. So hopefully people don't do that, but I'm trying to wrap my head around making sure that we don't create that inequities in the program already while we're setting it up.
Thanks, Cynthia. All right, I'm assuming that's an old hand, Marla. Back to you, Walrick, and then Marika.
Yeah, I guess I like what Marla, the example that Marla gave, and it was where my head was going, is like, Sally, and again, like, I think this is important to try to get to address, so I think there's alignment, or it sounds like there's agreement on okay, we don't want the fund to subsidize overpayment. That's one, but that won't go far. That certainly won't go far enough. But then there's the other, in order to go more in the direction of equity that Sally, you're describing, there's the option of paying more or providing more funding to those facilities that might struggle for one reason or another to be able to recruit, or they can't keep up in terms of the funding that somebody else might be able to get. That's the other. And then I guess the other piece that I think I heard from Cynthia is maybe something along the lines of, do you also, as a part of this recommendation, say if you're going to participate in the pay equity fund, you can't period, full stop, pay some percentage over, right? So I mean, it's like there's quasi flexibility there, but you still have a cap. So pay equity fund's not going to pay for it, but you can't pay if you want any access to the pay equity money, then you can't pay anyone more than X percent over. I mean, stacking all that together would probably get us closer side of what you described. That last piece, I just don't know, is that like just pushing it too far? Because is it pushing it too far? And then where do you set the level, right? What's the number? Is it 7% above? Is it 10% above? And you're basically forcing the hand of a particular school. Maybe that's what we want to do, but it's that last step I'm just not so sure about.
Marika.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intent of this was setting the minimum compensation level and not the maximum, so the floor, not the ceiling, as well as noting, like everyone else, that the equity adjustment does allow for some of that. I also think there's absolutely no way we can control the market in that way. For example, programs establish their fees, tuition. I mean, it's almost, if we're going to be going this far, then we may as well then set up a max tuition. I just feel like we're really, it feels like we're overstepping our boundaries a little bit. And I think the equity adjustment may be as far as we possibly can go, as well as, again, looking at what educators want. I know a couple of cases where, even though DCPS right now has higher salaries, educators chose to work and take a pay cut, essentially, to work in a childcare center because the working conditions, professional autonomy were more favorable. And so I definitely understand the struggle with the free market, so to speak. I think the equity adjustment may be as far as we possibly can go, and perhaps layer on the additional layer we can potentially provide is maybe support for programs understanding what factors contribute to retention, which sometimes can be more than salary. It could be working conditions, professional autonomy, and others. Salary, tuition reimbursement for an educator with young children who can also attend the program. I think that there are some other ways we can also layer on.
Thanks, Marika. So I think that what I'm hearing overall, and again, want people to check me on this, but is that there is that, okay, let's see what the key factors are here. So I think what I'm hearing is that having flexibility and discretion at the child development facility level is important to have, and is in some ways maybe, you know, too hard to control, even if we wanted to. That there are reasons for people setting salaries in different places that aren't necessarily reasons that drive inequity, although they could be, for sure, as Sally pointed, but they could also be reasons that support equity goals, to the point that Marla made. And so that's where thinking about how the equity adjustment in the funding formula plays in is particularly important, that getting that right so that programs that might not otherwise have the same kinds of access to resources are in a better position to be able to set their salaries, you know, at or above the salary scale. So that's one piece. And then a second piece is, seems like, again, there's broad support for having a model salary scale that is not only available to everybody, both employers, but also employees, to can see, like, this is what the sample is. My center may have certain differences, but I know what this is pegged to, so everyone has an ability to, you know, to sort of self-advocate, and that the funding levels should be set such that a facility can meet that. That's the goal of how the formula ultimately would land, understanding that it may take a minute to adjust up and down a little bit to get there. I don't believe that I'm hearing any you know, strong shifts among folks who are supportive of that discretion and the, you know, the basic approach that's described in the deck. I know you feel really strongly, Sally, and I don't want to, you know, I don't want to bully you into anything. So I want to make sure that we're sort of that everyone gets a chance to weigh in. But I think that's still where the group seems to be. So let me stop rambling. See if that resonates. Walrick.
I don't want to stay here, but I think it's super important that what Sally raised. I'm wondering if there's appetite from the group to, and if it's an administrative burden, I guess we can take it off. But if there's an ability to view where compensation levels are for any CF that's participating in the program, then can we at least monitor to see the degree to which what Sally's describing is happening? Because I mean, it's a recommendation, it's a policy, but it can certainly change, because I don't think that this group wants to be, or that the funding wants to go, even if you can't take the exact dollars. I remember on one of our earlier calls where Marlo was describing, like, you have places that can get outside funding. Well, they may not be using the pay equity fund money to do that, but if they have funding elsewhere, or if they're in a part of the city where they can actually charge more for tuition, we can't stop them from doing that. I understand that, but it does matter, to Sally's point. So I'm just wondering if there's appetite to at least look. If the data is going to be there, we should at least look and see, do we have facilities that really are just able to pay an outsized amount of money, and is that something that at a later point should be taken into consideration, just to keep an eye on it?
Yeah. I'm seeing some nods on that. And it certainly seems to me that, just as a general prospect with the things that we're recommending, because this is all going to be new, that there ought to be sort of checkpoints for ECE and stakeholders to say, like, all right, like, this was our intent here. Like, what is the impact? And that might be, I mean, certainly that's a data point that would be, seeing where salaries are and how they've changed over time and how they compare from one facility to another. All of that would be data that, that could be analyzed. So that feels right to me. I mean, I guess the piece that I'm hearing that I think there's strong agreement on is being really clear around the equity related intent of all of this. And so here are ways to try and advance that priority, including thinking really carefully about the equity adjustment and how that can be leveraged in that way. But also information, making sure that there's broad information out there, which again helps drive equity, because there's that transparency will help. So being clear on the intent behind that, so that as some of these policies get kind of, recorded in more practical ways, that it's not totally separated from the intent. Like, we were able to return and say, did this do what we intended it to do? Yeah, Marla, you said that much better than I did. So I'm gonna suggest that we move this to the next phase in sort of writing out where I think we are, and then there'll be a chance for people to poke that and figure out, does it in fact reflect what folks in this group are saying, and is there anything that that we could do to mitigate some of the concerns that people have, that that still feels in line with that. Does that work for everybody? And I want to thank you, Sally, for being really clear in your position and laying it out there for us, because I think it helps strengthen what we do. And I want everybody to feel like they can speak their truth in this conversation, because these are important decisions. Okay, so let's move on to our next topic here, which actually is very related, and we've already addressed some of it in this conversation. So hopefully it will be relatively easy. So one, I just want to share with everyone some updates to, these are slides again that you've seen any number of times, and they keep just getting somewhat tweaked. What you'll see here is that given the conversations that we have had, hold on, can't see my notes. Given the conversations we've had to date, okay, why can I not? All right, there. There are a couple of changes on here. So one, We removed the requirement that facilities that were not participating in capital quality observations would be required to have an observation, because there seemed to be not sufficient agreement on that. So to include that as a recommendation. So I removed it as a recommendation. I think that may be the only change on this. On this one, we added a couple of things that came up where there seemed to be strong support around that. One was to establish, in addition to the existing forums that ECE has, to establish a dedicated forum for stakeholder engagement regarding the the pay equity fund in particular, as its own dedicated forum. Sarah, reminded us that does not mean that those other forums would not be leveraged, because it's important to use those as well. And then also added, in addition to a funding appeal process for child development facilities, also a process for individual educators if they feel like they are not getting what they are entitled to per the pay equity fund. And again, that could look in some different ways and might not even necessarily be ECE. But that there needs to be a recommendation around that. So those are the updates there. They should all seem familiar. And then here, there are just a couple of things. One, again, took off the observation piece as a specific recommendation. And then the conversation that we had last time around the evaluation of the pay equity fund essentially noted that here are some basic data points that are likely to be, pretty foundational data, that some of which needs to be collected just for planning purposes, independent evaluation, but that are pretty straightforward. But that we want to recommend that there be a more focused conversation around evaluation a little bit further down the line, and that part of that is being really clear on what it is that we'd be evaluating in terms of objectives, and that currently while there is funding to collect administrative data, there is not funding in the pay equity fund for a full evaluation. So if that's a path that we go down, that would need to be rectified. So that said, want to note people's acknowledgement that this is a significant program, not just in terms of taxpayer dollars in DC, but in terms of what it indicates for the whole field, and that there's going to be interest in it. So people wanted to note that other people are interested in us doing an evaluation, even if we're not. Again, I think this is all stuff that we came to agreement on last time, but just wanted to note that these have been updated. We'll translate this into recommendations as well. So now we get to the funding formula approach. So again, we had these two basic examples that we looked at last time. Task force members weighed in on this, and the majority of folks landed on the example 2, which is the basic formula that we've been referring to, I think, during this conversation as well. There were some questions about it. There was particularly strong support for this idea of an equity adjustment, with the caveat that exactly how that equity adjustment is calculated feels really important to people. And there were a couple of specific suggestions in there. Sarah had mentioned in our last conversation that with the upcoming provider survey, which we're going to get like 100% response rate on, we will have some more information that could help create more sort of precise, that could allow us to do more precise equity adjustments that really reflect the communities and families that facility is serving, and the social vulnerability index can do that to some degree, but it has some inherent problems just because of the way it's built. So that was one thing that came up to folks. And then also, and again, this speaks to exactly the conversation we were just having, but while while folks support this general approach to this formula, that there was an acknowledgement that to the extent that you can peg that sort of average teacher a little bit higher, you do a number of things, including create. I mean, one, you protect against certain issues like if there are individual programs that happen to have more folks who are at a higher degree level, you know, you kind of, that comes out a little bit more in the wash. And then also some of the spillover effects that we've talked about, that would, you know, ultimately people could use those dollars in ways that made most sense for their facility. Obviously, that is all highly dependent on resource availability, but I just wanted to note that came up from a few folks. So again, this is basically what the sort of initial idea is, that the base input is just around teacher and assistant teacher FTEs, and some sort of equity adjustment that you know, could include the SVI and subsidy enrollment, but also there may be some more precise ways to do that. And here's the basic math might look like. So again, I think that there were, I guess there was one person who felt like that first approach could be more precise, but everyone else, you know, either was not sure or landed with the formula. So I want to do the same thing we did last time. My takeaway from this is that the basic approach to the formula is the right approach, that thinking carefully about the equity adjustment is really important, both because we wanted to actually reflect those facilities that for, you know, some of the reasons that Marla shared, and that others have shared, you know, might be disadvantaged in some way or another, in terms of being able to deliver on the expectations of the Pay Equity Fund, and we want to make sure that those facilities actually are the ones that are getting the equity bump, and that it's adequate to deliver on that. So that's one thing that I think people want to be really clear about. Yeah, so I think that's where I've landed, but want to open it up to pushback from folks who feel like there are things in here that don't seem right. And again, you can see everybody's specific comments in the appendix. Okay, I'm going to just charge ahead here, folks. I think we tired everybody out, because the exciting moment has come. I need a drum roll. We're going to talk about benefits, people. All right. Whew. So these first two slides are literally straight out of our first report. This is what we have already said. So we've already said that benefits are an important part of compensation, and we recognize that. Salary is important, but so are benefits. We recognize that that's part of the package. We also noted that ECE has already been doing some work to support early childhood employers in seeking out health benefits through the exchange, especially in this moment where through the American Rescue Plan, there are enhanced subsidies available. So now is a good time for both individuals and businesses to sign on. And then we talked about a recommendation to explore consortiums among providers that could help build a pool that has, you know, better buying power, and would lower the costs. So that was one specific strategy that we threw out there, including potentially leveraging the Shared Services Business Alliance to do that. There's a lot on here, but this is what in our first piece we said about benefits cliffs. A couple things I want to note is that, again, because we have limited data on current salaries and benefits, we don't have a good picture of how big the problem is or isn't in terms of benefits cliffs. So in other words, when people get this additional money either through the supplemental payments or through their increased salaries, what will that do to individuals in terms of potentially losing benefits but not gaining enough in new income that they really make up that difference and get beyond it. So we don't know, and because we have this 3 jurisdiction reality with Maryland, Virginia, and the district, it makes it just way more complicated because there are plenty of people who, for example, live in the district and so qualify for Medicaid because our levels of, our eligibility levels are much more generous, and that, someone could work in the same facility, live in a different jurisdiction, have, be making the same amount of money and have a different picture. So there are lots of things that complicate this. So, noting that complexity. But we did have a few specific suggestions around how to think about this. A couple things I want to add, and Rakaya and Marla in particular should chime in because we've been on a little roadshow tour talking to a bunch of folks around these issues, and a couple of things that just make this even more, sticky. One is that given the public health emergency that we're still in right now at the federal level, one of the things that has meant is that people who have been getting Medicaid benefits have not lost their eligibility, even if their income is high enough that they normally would. And so they stay on the rolls, which, I think is obviously a very smart policy. The timing of it is challenging because that's set to expire April 16th. And so at that point, states will begin to reassess eligibility and move people off the rolls if they're no longer eligible. So the timing of that just is going to intersect with the timing of initial supplemental payments, over the summer. And that is what it is, but I just want to note that makes this even more complex. And then similarly, the point around the additional subsidies for the marketplace that ARPA that the American Rescue Plan has provided. At this point, those are scheduled to sunset at the end of this calendar year, so the end of December, and maybe Congress will get its act together and extend them, but maybe it won't. And so again, that means that directing people that is a particular additional support for benefits could go away. So I just listed, these are things that have come up in our conversations already, and I want to just highlight a few of them and then open up the floor to how people want to, things that people want to focus on and where we should take this conversation. So the first that we've talked about a fair bit is that as we launch these supplemental payments, that probably the most important thing that we need to do is to make sure that educators have good information to be able to make good decisions for themselves and their families. We had a helpful conversation with Martha's Table and another one with Bread for the City around how they have approached this with their cash assistance programs that have some of the same challenges, and actually some challenges that we don't have. And what they said is that providing that information to folks, and people will make different decisions because they know their situation best, but they need the good information to be able to make those decisions. And that one of the things that they have done that I think they thought was very, a very important piece of this was to provide in addition to just, written and sort of video information that people could all have access to provide the option for individual benefits counseling. Now I put that out there because it's a specific idea that's come up. I want to note that the scale of what we're talking about in terms of number of people is way bigger than anything that they have been talking about. Doesn't mean can't be done. It just means that it's a bigger lift and that it would cost money. So just want to flag that. And then another piece that feels like just, again, very immediate is just gathering more information, both from child development facilities and from educators around what the current status even is in terms of health benefits overall. So what's our starting point? And that will, again, help to think about where we need to go. Some longer term strategies that folks have talked about. The first is, to the extent that there are excess, in big old quotes, public education, I keep saying pay equity fund. PEF means another thing in another part of my life. Pay equity fund dollars could be put towards some sort of emergency benefits fund. And we've heard that done in other jurisdictions, where there are particular cases where, people have, particular benefits close challenges, for example. A second approach to begin building in baseline expectations for employer provided benefits as a condition of participating in the pay equity fund. Again, we wouldn't want to do that if we weren't confident that the funding would allow people to meet those expectations. So it's a follow on to the conversation we just had, but with probably even less information about where we stand. The health benefits consortiums that we talked about, SSBA, and I see Cynthia's note in the chat on that. And then several of you have been really helpful in forwarding all the examples that you hear about different legislative approaches elsewhere that that could think about this in broader ways. So targeted marketplace subsidies for a particular subgroup. If you're a childcare worker, you get this subsidy, for example. There are larger scale efforts that legislatively other places have tried. And certainly the task force could recommend, either some specific strategies or that there be more thinking about that. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was just a ton, but I wanted to give that initial brain dump. And what I'm going to just invite people to do is, I want us to start to figure out what makes sense in terms of the scope of our recommendations, and are there particular strategies that you think are feel viable and feel really high priority in terms of what we would want to emphasize, towards ECE, or some of these recommendations might not be to ECE, they might be to the council or to the mayor or to someone else, where ECE doesn't really have the locus of control. So and I think my instinct is that we could put a laundry list of things, which will probably be less helpful than really identifying some priorities that we feel like would be important. So I will stop there. And I feel like if Rakaya and Marla don't speak up, I'm gonna put you on the spot because I know you all have been thinking about this a lot.
I nominate Rakaya.
I don't know that I mean, I'm not a health policy person, but kind of, I think like the principle that I will name is the Birth to 3 law named compensation and defined compensation as salary and benefits. I think that is a comprehensive and not a like emergency situation. And so, and I like am, you know, I think that we should be thoughtful about where it makes sense for it, who it makes sense to hold that part of things. But I do think that whatever we choose, even if we can't fully define it because we didn't recruit health policy experts, if like you pass it off to the Committee on Health, like those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. But I think it needs to be fairly expansive. And I say that with the understanding that currently where we are in the funding, I think the original estimate, which I know is rough, did not include the equity adjustment, right? And so there's a likelihood that like what we're looking at is actually like potentially up to what we have or higher if we include the equity adjustment. And so I'll add the caveat that like there may need to be a funding solution, but I do think that our recommendation should be like a pretty big one in terms of just making sure that every teacher, we're raising folks' salaries and we're not putting them in the position of losing and not having access to quality important benefits. So I think that you know, I'm really interested in the like subsidies, either direct to the businesses or like built in for the individuals in the marketplace based on, you know, certain criteria. I like that idea. You know, I think that like pairing that with like some of the SSBA approach, pairing it with like early learning program kind of pools makes sense. So something in that range is kind of the scale that I think is important to consider. But that's as much as I can say. And I can't say that I have more than that.
Thanks, Rakaya. And I'll also note that I think that this group has noted, you know, health benefits as like a particular and obvious priority, but is not the only piece of benefits. So I just want to also name that, you know, that in addition to health benefits, retirement benefits as, you know, as an element of this has I think come up a fair bit as well. Some of the leave related stuff, I think the city has taken on more broadly. So some of that is now in, I think, a better position than if we had done this, you know, a year or two ago, but even there around, you know, paid leave. So I just want to open up to those ideas as well, at risk of making this even more challenging.
And the only recommendation that I will offer, because again, I think you said it perfectly, you can get into, from the conversations we have, you can get into a laundry list of potential trails to go around and go down. And I think that the one thing that the district benefit from is a task force to look at benefits cliffs and to look at aligning federal, local, and not in our case, state policy and dollars to make this make sense. Because what was abundantly clear as we talked to the different people is that every situation is so specialized and thus unpredictable, and yet a barrier to breaking the cycle of poverty, that this is a worthy study in and of itself. And I just think it will inform policy across the spectrum in the district. And so a deep dive needs to happen to bring this together and to really make policy adjustments and legislative adjustments.
Thanks, Marla. Sally.
Is there, I mean, this is a city full of law firms, many of them that do wonderful pro bono work in terms of issues like this. And, you know, it's such important work. And, you know, has there been given any thought to kind of reaching out to resources that we have that are free, that, you know, that maybe could help advise this task force and the program going forward of what to do? I mean, you know, like I said, this is a city rich in resources that do give their resources, you know, that do good work via pro bono.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Other reactions and thoughts? And I do think that the time frame on some of this, so with the stuff, you know, with the short-term mechanism, while we certainly, you know, can, and OSSI already is, you know, doing work to support employers and thinking about benefits issues broadly, and that should continue to happen. It's obviously not, it doesn't play out specifically in terms of supplemental payments, because you're getting what you're getting. The benefits cliffs issue is the more immediate issue, and I do think that because it is, well, so I guess there's some work that I think we can leverage other work in the city around, you know, what that like information sheet looks like. And you know, Martha's table had like a chart that, you know, laid out like where you were at risk for what. Obviously we've got those, you know, the online calculators, et cetera. The question around individual benefits counseling, I want to throw that out there and get people's reaction as to whether that feels like something that we would recommend prioritizing, again, with the not insignificant caveat that it would potentially come with, you know, with a cost. Now, maybe, Sally, we get, you know, law firms to provide free benefits counseling, and that's the way to, you know, to get at this. But if they have a caseload of, you know, 2,000 educators who want to talk to them, you know, they may need some help as well. So anyway, wanted to open that one up. Also, other things that are coming to people's minds. Yeah, Sarah.
I just want to say that providing individual benefit counseling is not something I believe that OSSI can be committed to do. Some of this kind of counseling cannot be done by individuals who do not have certain kinds of legal or accounting credentials. And as a government agency, we cannot give people advice that would appear to establish their eligibility for another government program that's outside of our purview. You know, there are things that could be worked on in a long-term way around how some of these things are integrated, but I want to be very careful about what we are being directed or committed to do, because we can't do things that step outside of things that are appropriate to the kinds of expertise that we have, or would make commitments we can't make in this area.
Yeah, for sure. And to be clear, the examples and the people that we talked to at Martha's Table and Bread for the City, and Bread for the City has actually legal services, unit. And one of the things that they do is benefits counseling. And so that's how they approached it. They also talked about contracting with Whitman Walker, which I didn't know does a lot of benefits counseling. So yes, I mean, in terms of where it would need to be expertise. And again, because of our tri-jurisdiction situation, you need people who know all the jurisdictions, or you need to go to the person who knows your jurisdiction. So it's not, like it's complicated. Any other thoughts when you think about what feels like priority, like high priority in terms of the kinds of recommendations that we would want to make? What feels pressing?
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Marika.
Yeah, it's not a direct answer to your question. I'm sorry if this is derailing the conversation, but I think as we consider benefits, and certainly I'm not keeping in mind the price tag of this project, Is there a way we can infuse benefits into the equity, equity formula? Sorry, I forgot the way it's framed in the document.
Equity adjustment.
Equity adjustment, yeah.
Yeah, say more about what that might look like.
I mean, in some ways, these educators and or the market does not, because of the ways in which we've funded childcare, benefits is positioned as a nice to have and not built in. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can just acknowledge that in the equity adjustment to allow for some just flat support for that, which means potentially all of the programs could potentially qualify for this equity adjustment. But I imagine that will affect the price point significantly. But I'm wondering if there's a sort of another way of handling it where we just recognize that it will be challenging for all programs to navigate benefits. And so because of that, it is an industry-wide equity adjustment versus a subset of an equity adjustment that only impacts a subset of the programs. Again, just a wild card idea.
Yeah, I mean, it even, I mean, even beyond that, Marika, I could see, and again, like part of this is figuring out the price tag. But in the same way that we are approaching a base formula that looks at the, you know, the difference between the average like status quo salary and the average new salary as a way of funding programs to meet the new salary scale, you could essentially do something similar. So in the cost of care model, you know, there's assumptions around benefits, and those could be, you know, beefed up or whatever, but then there could be a you know, assumptions around what currently people are actually, you know, providing or whatever, and then what it would cost to meet a certain standard, and you just build that into the funding formula. To Rakaya's point, that is clearly going to go well above the current amount that's in the public in the pay equity fund, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be more in it down the line if it becomes clear that in order to meet the expectation of birth to 3 that it has to be more than that.
I mean, to use a word we've used before, sort of the signaling, right? I mean, it does an interesting signaling if there's an affordable signaling option to consider.
Yeah. And so, right. So maybe you set like an initial, like the expectation is more basic early on to meet the price tag, but that we're sending the message that benefits is part of, Michael.
Hey, I'm sorry I'm off camera. I keep having internet issues, I think because my kids are playing all the Frozen songs in all the rooms in my house. I guess my other thought on the sort of the benefit side is that like we have some short-term issues and some long-term issues spooling up here, and I'm like very sensitive to like not having enough money in the PEF, which I will not force you to remember what that stands for, to do what we should be doing in terms of benefits right away. But it does seem like it would be a really good idea to be setting aside something because we are going to benefit cliff some people unless we're like unbelievably cognizant of every individual circumstance. And I mean, I think it's like a very good idea for us to engage with local stakeholders and everyone we can to like help counsel people through this. But I also think it's probably useful to like have some backup fund that makes sure, kind of getting back to the signaling point, that like in the short term that like no one has any horror stories of like, oh, like we, like my center got this big reimbursement for the pay equity fund and it totally got zeroed out because I lost all the benefits I was already getting. And that strikes me as fairly different from the longer term problem of like trying to actually build proper benefits into the system, which is a thing I think we should either be striving towards or have like a pretty unified approach in terms of like, you know, if the Medicaid formula is such that like we really do want centers to be making use of like DC's pretty solid Medicaid programs, that, you know, we're pretty deliberate about that, and we're clear about why we're doing that, that it's like because it's way more cost effective to do it that way because of federal funds or providers or like all of the difficulties of like getting through one of these markets as a small business. But I guess I just have like strong thoughts about the like getting the long term right, but also like making sure that we don't forget about the short term and everything that can go wrong and scare people off and sort of erode support for something that's a really good idea.
Thanks, Michael. Warwick.
Yeah, so just building on what Michael said, I mean, so there's sort of like in that whole spirit or principle of like do no harm, in the short term, there's like a fund there, but to, I think, was it Rakaya who said like compensation is it's the cash and the benefits part, and this task force, like we're trying to solve that problem, but I think we're going to come up, there's a lot more information that's needed to really solve that benefits part of it, and having the clear recommendation around like the resources need to be put towards answering or coming up with a better answer, a longer term answer to that question. But in the interim, like I think to Michael's point, it's like there has to be something, or I think there should be something to have as a backstop, because it is very likely that we'll run into this, and it goes against like having people fall over the cliff. It goes completely against what we're trying to accomplish.
Marla.
I have a question for Sarah. So it's completely understandable to me that ECE cannot participate in the benefits counseling process itself, but is it able to provide support, resources, and financial support to something like Neighborhood Legal or so that these questions could be asked of individuals in support of them making the best and most informed decision for themselves? So not ECE doing it itself, but through some process, providing the resources for another entity or and non-governmental at that for that matter, to provide this kind of support to people.
I think, Marla, the answer to that is theoretically that is within the realm of possibility. I think there are a number of questions around authority, funding, and either procurement or grant making processes that would need to be navigated in order to facilitate doing anything like that. None of that means that like it is something that is completely impossible, but it may be more complex about how to do that than is apparently obvious.
Okay, and that makes sense to me too. What about DHS? I'm just saying, is there an agency that we could partner with that would have that authority to support this issue? That's so when I say ECE, sometimes I'm using you as a proxy for DC government writ large.
And I can't speak for other parts of DC government, but obviously we are happy to engage with and partner with folks around this. I know DHS is working on issues related to benefit cliffs and 2-gen strategy. Again, because so many of these programs intersect with federal funding, there's a lot of complexity there. And particularly since there are things in the federal side that, you know, just as many of us are disappointed that Build Back Better didn't happen for childcare, there are things that would have happened for health on those pieces too, some of which, you know, could theoretically still happen. And all of that means we're trying to like figure out how to jump on a moving ball, and just makes this much more complicated to navigate at this point in time for them as well, because they're also dealing with, trying to stand on the moving ball and do all the stuff they're doing. Yeah.
Walrick, was that an old? Yeah,
Nope,
okay.
new hand. Just thinking about what Sarah was saying, do we, and Abigail, did I hear correctly that like, I'm thinking about the wage environment right now and the fact that, wages are going up. And so are we currently in an environment where folks would be, or not would be, but are approaching that cliff and have to navigate those decisions? Or Abigail, did I hear you correctly that because of the pandemic, that it's basically like suspended folks losing their benefits? I'm just trying to think about like, is how, if this is being experienced now, how are like, what is the agency, who is helping people to like navigate this question? And maybe we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is just so complicated and all over the place, because individual situations are, I mean, I've said this to y'all before, but if you want to waste several hours, just sit down with that benefits calculator that the Atlanta Fed put together and start putting in different combinations and see if you can figure out patterns. I mean, it is so all over the place. And I think that the changes that are upcoming just make that more complicated. But I mean, I will say that, one of the things that I think is going to be important for us to think about on the benefits cliffs issue is that obviously, if there's someone who is in a situation where getting this additional money, whether it's the one-time or supplemental payment or whether it's in your salary, moves you to a different place on the benefit scale, losing your benefits per se is not we shouldn't count that as a defeat, right? Like, part of what we're trying to do is move people to a different part of the wage scale where they're not dependent on benefits. Getting there could feel like you think you're getting a $10,000 or $15,000 raise, and it really only feels like a $5,000 raise, which is a bummer, but you're still better off than you were. You know what I mean? So part of this, I want to acknowledge that just simply the fact of losing benefits is not what we're working against. It's where in that scale you fall, and you could end up actually worse off, and that's really that is a defeat on our part. But I just wanted to sort of clarify that. Cynthia.
One of the things that I wanted to make sure that, and you mentioned a little bit about that, where I am, benefits always been a big issue for me because I'm a small business and I'm family childcare. So my income and trying to support myself within that income when you're not even in the cost model. So it's trying to be able, because receiving benefits for a small business like myself, you have to at least have 2 staff that's receiving benefits. And because one of my staff already received Medicaid benefits, that leave me by myself to pay the maximum by myself. So I'm really concerned about that benefits piece, to be able to have it so that I can afford it for myself. Now that this salary scale is coming, I don't want to be able to get the money. And then that's how important benefits is to me. I want it to be, if it's part of the birth to 3 and we need to be thinking about it, I'm hoping that we can keep that piece together, because I'm a person that's struggling with the fact of making sure I can pay benefits for myself or going to the free clinic. And that's what we don't want people to be able to do. And I want the reality of that to resonate with everybody here, that people that are at the bottom, just, okay, it's a pay scale and we come in with equity, but that benefit have to be there. Because if I'm going to gain more money and lose a benefit that I'm already paying way more than I could if I had an additional staff online with me, you have to have 2 people. So if I'm just the one person, I'm paying $600 or $700 a month just for benefits, which is ridiculous. So let us just keep that benefit piece up at the forefront. And I get where everybody is, but it really is a serious matter. And people to lose it, hey, if you got a good job and you're not losing it, then it's not your issue. But when you're in a situation like myself and like many other small business owners, it is a big thing. Because I am over 50. And so a lot of us in my constituency is over 50. So we need more mammograms. We need a slew of other health things that we're going through. But the benefit is a great piece to me. And I think we need to most definitely get the research, the data, and make sure that it's covered for each member, each child development staff.
Thanks, Cynthia. So I think that the piece around benefits being core to a compensation package, I think that you said that really well, and that needs to be really, clear. Again, I think we've named it, but I think we want to emphasize it, and recognizing that the available funding is not likely to deliver on that in the current iteration. The other thing that I take away from what you're saying, Cynthia, which I think is just really important to note, is again recognizing that particularly for family childcare, where you do not have the economies of scale by definition in terms of staff, that there needs to be particular solutions that work for for those settings. Small centers have some of the same challenges, but obviously child development homes and expanded homes, by definition do, and that's something that we want to name. Sally and then Rakaya.
So I recognize we're talking about two different things. And yes, I agree that benefits need to be thought about in the long term. But since the short term is going to be upon us sooner than the long term, do we, and I know you all have had conversations with Martha's Table and, have done some, additional kind of investigation about the benefits cliff and what the short-term payments will do. And I think, again, this goes back to the communication that individuals need to recognize that this is going to be a one-time payment, not a raise in their salary, right? This short-term doesn't equate to a raise. It equates to a stipend or a bonus or whatever language we want to use around that. And I think they have to recognize that there's going to be a gap between the short term and potentially when the long term and increased salaries will occur. So do we have a sense from your fact gathering of what is going to be best just in general, and we not getting into any individual situations, but a one lump sum or a multiple payments, what type of scenario does the least harm? And then looking, once we have that kind of premise, then what types of supports do we talk about bringing in terms of advice to individuals? But I think this goes back to that communication of we've got to be really clear about the difference between the short-term and long-term, that there's going to be a gap. If they lose their benefits, is it for a short term? Is it going to be for a longer term until the long-term salary scale comes into effect? So, I think that's information that we need.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And I think maybe we'll communicate what we've learned on that, maybe in writing to give a little more detail. But the quick piece there is, I don't think that the lump sum solution is gonna resolve all our problems on the benefits cliff front, based on the conversations that we've had. And remember that what we've laid out now is the expectation that the supplemental payments may cross over also into the beginning of the next fiscal year, that the new system will likely not be stood up at the very beginning, sort of when for the fiscal year to start. So all of that to say that might span a little bit of a longer time. I think your point still stands, Sally, in terms of the faster that we can get to a place where we can give really clear information to people so that they can start doing their own investigation of, given their situation, what makes most sense for them, the better. Rakaya, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add on the short term, because I think folks have said it, and we've been in a lot of those conversations together. And yeah, I think early communication, as much as possible, if we can do some sort of counseling support for folks, that would be great. Maybe we can talk to our the philanthropy community about supporting that if we can't do it through government. Maybe just thinking about communicating it and trying to get folks as much support as they can. I don't have anything beyond what folks have already said, so I don't want to talk about that much more. But what I was going to say about the long term is I don't think we should limit our recommendations to what we have the funds for right now. I think we can make a recommendation and council will say, this is not currently implementable due to the funds, but the task force has recommended that this happen. And there is a lot that can happen over the course of a year to kind of start to correct those gaps, or a couple of years. And so those are the kinds of things that I would like for us to maybe be open to making a recommendation about what we want. Maybe saying, with the caveat, we know right now maybe we can't do this. We know that the funding won't necessarily go this far, but this is where we need to get to. And here's maybe a short-term solution for the first couple of years or so to use the funds that we do have to start to address this. And so I guess that's what I would love to encourage everyone to think about is can we just name what we want and what we think is necessary for the sector, and then let's figure out the funding piece separately, because I just don't want us to limit ourselves. And that is what I've got.
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense. And I think, as long as we're clear that we recognize where, because we're going to be laying out program costs that's one of the required, elements of this. So it'll be clear that if there are things that we're recommending that are beyond that, we'll have to note it. But there's nothing that says we can't recommend that more of this happen that will require additional funding. And I know that Marika, you've also, I see Walrick chimed in on the chat on that, and I feel like Marika, that has been a drum that you've been beating along the way, and so I think I think we can be really clear on that. All right, so I think this was a very productive meeting, and what I'm gonna I'm not gonna make a specific commitment right this second, but I'm going to share with you all, once I figure out what is doable, a time frame for when these elements that we sort of the big elements we started to land on will be in writing in the draft report, so that you all can start looking at that, and we can do it a little bit iteratively. And as another next step, I mentioned this last time, but Sarah and folks on her team at ECE are pulling together a group from this task force that are our provider experts to do some looking at some scenarios for how some of the funding might play out, to just do some pressure testing around the approach that we've been talking about, and just see whether it feels like it's actually going to work, so that we're able to have a little bit more confidence in what we put in the report, based on people's real situations. So with that, thank you all very much for your time tonight, and have a good evening, everyone.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.